You are tuned in to a Fireside chat with Zany Mystic. Join us now on another exciting metaphysical journey. Relax, tune in, drop out, and take a seat by the fire as we explore new realms and possibilities. This is Magenta Pixie. You can find me at magentapixie.weebly.com. But now, here is Zany Mystic and guest. Enjoy the show.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to a Fireside Chat with Zany Mystic. I'm your host, Lance White. Tonight, my guest is Darren Littlejohn, who was highly recommended by another of my wonderful guests, Penny Pierce, who wrote the book Intuition. Darren is a recovering addict and a practitioner of Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, as well as a former mental health specialist. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psych in 1991 and worked in clinical dependency and acute psychiatric care facilities during college. He has been a Buddhist practitioner since the mid-1980s. A spiritual crisis led to a relapse in 1994 after 10 years of sobriety. Once regaining sobriety in 1997, Darren worked on recovery with a new zeal, incorporating many years of psychotherapy, 12-step work, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhist practices. While relapse with long-term sobriety is common, returning for sustained duration is extremely rare. Darren's program, which became the basis for the book, The 12-Step Buddhist, is an integrated approach that has developed over a span of more than 20 years. Tonight is a very special night for Darren, so let's welcome him to the show now and find out why. Hi, Darren. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic, Lance. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've wanted to do a show like this for a long time. But before we begin, didn't you mention something about tonight being a special time for you?
Yeah, today's my 5,000th day clean and sober.
Wow. Congratulations and kudos to you. That's a wonderful accomplishment. And while I'm saying this, I'd like to honor all of those who are listening tonight or who will be listening in the future who are on the path of spiritual sobriety and freedom from addictions, myself included, whether it's 24 hours or 30 or 40 years. Well, to start out, maybe we could follow a bit of the format from the rooms, and you could tell us a little bit about what it was like, what happened, and what it is, and how it is now.
Well, what it was like for me is that I started drinking and doing drugs when I was 14 years old, and I basically quit school as soon as I started getting high. I was in the summer between 7th and 8th grade, so 7th grade is the last grade that I actually completed. I became a full-time drug addict and bad attempt at a pot dealer, and I struggled with that until I was 22, and I entered a 30-day treatment center, which was popular and paid for by insurance back in the this was in 84. So back in the 80s, they still had insurance for that kind of thing, pretty readily available.
Right.
And I went ahead and did 30 days and started doing 12-step groups after that, and I got fully involved in that and stayed clean and sober, went to college, raised a child on my own, more or less, and had a little help, but as a single parent going to college, that sort of thing, staying sober. And I got into a point after I was in my 10th year of sobriety, and I decided to pull what we call in recovery a geographic, which means I'd like to be somewhere else, and I'll feel better when I get there.
Right.
And when you show up, you realize inevitably that you brought you with you. And I got to Texas, a California boy, and I felt a little bit odd because, you know, it was Texas, and they see things a little differently than I was used to. And I got in there and basically kind of gave up doing my 12-step program and got more into my other things. And one of those things I got into was taking LSD and practicing meditation. I thought that would be a really great idea. It actually wasn't a great idea. And these are the kind of ideas that we come up with when we leave the nest of our 12-step support system sometimes.
Yeah.
And I found out I was looking for a deep, penetrating psychological insight. And I did have one, if you'd like me to share what that was with you.
Yes, I would love it.
Yeah, I found out that I was extremely depressed, and on a deep, deep level. So the drugs and meditation really took me into a place of darkness, and I found that was really not sufficient. So I found that I really needed to experiment with some more modern drugs. I felt that it was maybe outdated, and maybe ecstasy was a better idea because that was, after all, designed for group therapy and bonding. But I took it and I got paranoid and upset and had to leave the club and go home and sit by myself. So I basically got real depressed about that drugs not working and started drinking and using again. So I went on and off into sobriety for the most part for a couple, 3 years. And then in 97, I accidentally wound up in a 12-step meeting. Purely by accident. I did not go there intentionally. I wandered into the room, literally, and for some reason I sat down, and there was a cute girl there, and she invited me to sit down, and I try not to ignore a request like that from a girl.
Right.
So I sat down, and that was December 4th, 1997, 5,000 days ago today.
Wow.
So, I found out in coming back into sobriety, that's really difficult to have long-term sobriety and then come back and reintegrate into 12-step as if you'd never heard any of it before. I found out that the 12-step recovery program for me is necessary, but ultimately is not sufficient in and of itself to gain what you mentioned, spiritual sobriety. And it's a really interesting topic. So after a few years struggling back, staying into 12-step work, I had started some therapy actually right in the beginning in the first year. And I've actually continued that actually for over 13 years now. I stay with a therapist at all times and have somebody to reflect my great ideas off of, and
right,
as well as my 12-step community, because there's nothing like a guy with 2 years sober who knows it all to set you straight. And there's plenty of those guys and gals around. So
yeah,
I stay in that. I stay real close to that. I'm actually standing outside the meeting that I would be at right now, where we know on this call. So I happen to be I'm actually in the hallway of the church talking to you guys. So
how wonderful.
So, but I found out that I had to go back to my Zen practice, which I had gotten into in the 90s with Joko Beck, the author of Everyday Zen. Joko just passed. Coincidentally, on Sakadawa, the Buddhist triple holiday on the 15th of June, she died that day. I don't know how, but she was my first real teacher, and she had taught me a lot. But I had found that when I came to these spiritual practices that were they're designed for normal people. They're not designed. Joko actually says this in a I think it's a Tricycle article that I just dug up recently when she was passing. She actually says this. If you're disturbed, you got to seek some outside help. So I believe that the addict's mind is definitely, at least mine, is definitely one that's disturbed. And I found that these practices like Zen Buddhism and so forth were really interesting and awesome, but for some reason I couldn't quite make it work. And if I went to the 12-step community, I couldn't quite get enough from that. I mean, I could stay sober, but I couldn't quite get the spiritual insights I was looking for at the time. So I began kind of weaving together this fabric of spiritual practice, with a thread going through the different aspects like psychotherapy, medication, if it's necessary. I did that for a couple of years, and the various Buddhist practices and so forth. So I found that, around 2005, I guess, or something like that, I had gotten into this Tibetan Buddhist lineage, and I'd started I'd met a teacher and her teacher and the other teachers, and I started going on retreats and really paying attention to these things. And I started really getting sort of an accelerated understanding of what I'd been missing in my knowledge, at least. Maybe there's plenty more to learn for sure, but I just got kind of an insight and a clarity that I started weaving it together where it made sense to me how to deal with the higher power and how important 12-step program is, and yet how to be the addict in the Buddhist community, because you stand out like a sore thumb as an addict, and I found a lot of things. So I started writing about it. I started blogging about it. Kind of that writing stimulated some nice feedback. People told me I should really continue, and my therapist actually suggested, why don't you should write your story down. So I did that and started working on integrating methods of Buddhist meditation practice, psychotherapy, and so on, voice dialoguing process, and so on, into what is now the book. And that's been going. The book's been out in print a little bit over 2.5 years, and it's still getting great reviews, and I get constant emails from people telling me how much they appreciate it and so forth. So it's really interesting because I teach a group every week on basically integrating the different tools into recovery and using Buddhist terminology and principles to understand recovery and vice versa, and how to use that. I've been doing this for I think about 4 years now, weekly here and around the country, different workshops and retreats. We've actually got a summer retreat coming up here at Brighton Bush Hot Springs on the 28th of August, and a winter retreat, and this will be our third one in January at the Hot Springs. So things are coming along, and people are catching on, and there are some other books that were out before mine that I think kind of introduced people to some of the ideas. I just didn't feel that the work that was done at that time had really taken it as far as it needed to go, and they certainly were missing the components of mental illness, being dually diagnosed, the issues of relapsing with long-term sobriety, and basically what really amounts to the existential dilemma or the spiritual crisis that many, many people in recovery face with long-term sobriety. My sponsor calls that the funnel. We go into the funnel, and sometimes we don't come out. And some people die. Some people commit suicide sober. And there's a real high relapse rate. It's a high relapse rate among treatment professionals in the field. And so there's a lot that can be done to help people understand. I mean, for me to help myself understand, how to stay sober this time through the darker periods, if that makes sense. So that's why I use this. I always like my dope strong. I like my coffee strong, and I like all my medicines strong. So I use real strong medicine to treat a really, really powerful disease.
Well, that makes total sense. That makes total sense. And I like the way that I've always been fascinated by Zen Buddhism and some of the Tibetan and various other forms of spiritual pursuits, disciplines, and to be able to weave those together seems like a wonderful marriage. A lot of people have difficulty with how to create a higher power, what is a higher power, and when people come into this 12-step program, many feel that it's a religious group or that it's all about God or something. Can you address that a little bit and maybe explain more about the 12-step program?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, some of the criticisms are accurate. And as somebody who's been in this since 26 years now, I mean, I'm very aware of some of the tendencies within the 12-step program to get a little bit fundamentalist and self-righteous and dogmatic. And it's probably like anything else based on the fear of what'll happen if you drink again, and this is the way that works, and this is the only way it works, and I kind of narrow-minded tunnel vision, but it's really unhealthy. in the long run, although it does work to keep, it helps a lot of people to a certain point. So I use the 12-step community, and I use it, but I mean, I participate in the 12-step community, and I use the 12
recovery with a new zeal, incorporating many years of psychotherapy, 12-step work, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhist practices. While relapse with long-term sobriety is common, returning for sustained duration is extremely rare. Darren's program, which became the basis for the book, The 12-Step Buddhist, is an integrated approach that has developed over a span of more than 20 years.
You are tuned in to a Fireside Chat with Zany Mystic. Join us now on another exciting metaphysical journey. Relax, tune in, drop out, and take a seat by the fire as we explore new realms and possibilities. This is Magenta Pixie. You can find me at magentapixie.weebly.com. But now, here is Zany Mystic and guest. Enjoy the show.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to a Fireside Chat with Zany Mystic. I'm your host, Lance White. Tonight, my guest is Darren Littlejohn, who was highly recommended by another of my wonderful guests, Penny Pierce, who wrote the book Intuition. Darren is a recovering addict and a practitioner of Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. Tonight is a very special night for Darren, so let's welcome him to the show now and find out why. Hi, Darren. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic, Lance. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've wanted to do a show like this for a long time. But before we begin, didn't you mention something about tonight being a special time for you?
Yeah, today's my 5,000th day clean and sober.
As well as a former mental health specialist. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psych in 1991 and worked in clinical dependency and acute psychiatric care facilities during college. He has been a Buddhist practitioner since the mid-1980s. A spiritual crisis led to a relapse in 1994 after 10 years of sobriety. Once regaining sobriety in 1997, Darren worked on recovery